What was supposed to be an ordinary, carefree afternoon in the park turned into a nightmare that would change young Sophia Carter's life forever. In the very place she felt safest, surrounded by memories of her father's unwavering dedication to the community, she found herself trapped, alone, powerless, and face-to-face with a man who wore the same uniform as her dad, but wielded his authority with malice. The laughter of children and the rustle of the trees faded into an ominous silence as Sophia's encounter with Officer Henry Gates escalated. What began as a harsh tone and cold stares quickly spiraled into something far worse. Fear gripped her as he crossed every boundary of decency, turning the park, her sanctuary, into a scene of humiliation and terror. Her father's arrival couldn't have been timelier, but what unfolded next wasn't just about one child's safety. It was the beginning of a reckoning, a fight for justice that would ripple through their community and beyond. Before we dive deeper into Sophia's gripping and inspiring journey of courage and change, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you're as intrigued by this story as we are, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on more incredible tales like this one. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and 13-year-old Sophia Carter eagerly made her way to Brookfield Park. The sprawling park was her favorite place in the city, a haven of tall trees, meandering trails, and the laughter of families enjoying their time outdoors. More importantly, it was where her father, Captain Ethan Carter, spent many of his weekends patrolling. For as long as Sophia could remember, the park had been a symbol of comfort and joy for her. She loved wandering through its lush greenery, feeling the cool breeze brush against her cheeks as she listened to the sounds of birds chirping and water flowing gently in the nearby creek. It was where she felt closest to her father, who had taught her to appreciate the beauty of nature and instilled in her a strong sense of justice. Today, Sophia wore her favorite sneakers and jeans, ready to surprise her dad, as she often did. Her father's face would always light up when she appeared unexpectedly during his shifts. He'd pause, wrap her in a warm hug, and ask about her day, always making her feel like she was the most important part of his world. The park was bustling with activity that day. Children ran across the open fields, their laughter echoing through the air, while couples strolled hand in hand along the trails. Families had spread out their blankets under the shade of the giant oak trees, enjoying picnics and sharing stories. Sophia smiled to herself as she inhaled the fresh scent of grass mingling with the faint aroma of food wafting from the picnic areas. As she wandered deeper into the park, Sophia's thoughts turned to her dad. Captain Ethan Carter wasn't just her father, he was a respected figure in the community. He had dedicated his career to keeping Brookfield Park safe, ensuring it remained a welcoming space for everyone. Sophia's heart swelled with pride whenever she saw him in uniform, standing tall and confident as he interacted with park-goers. Walking along the familiar paths, she let her guard down, reveling in the peaceful atmosphere. She didn't have a care in the world, certain that her father's watchful eye made the park the safest place she could be. But as she ventured further along one of the quieter trails, something shifted. The air grew heavier, the lively chatter of the park fading into an eerie silence. Sophia glanced around, noticing that the crowds had thinned considerably. The families and children she had passed earlier were nowhere to be seen. The cheerful atmosphere of the main areas seemed to dissipate the farther she walked, replaced by a strange stillness that made her stomach tighten. Up ahead, near a secluded bench tucked under a large tree, Sophia spotted a police officer she didn't recognize. He stood alone, his posture rigid, and his eyes locked on her as if he had been waiting. Sophia hesitated, her steps slowing as unease prickled at her skin. She knew most of her dad's team, but this officer's face wasn't familiar. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming in the sunlight, but something about the way he stood, the hard set of his jaw, and the cold intensity in his eyes made her pulse quicken. For a brief moment she wondered if he was a friend of her dad's. Maybe he was new to the precinct. She tried to brush off the unsettling feeling creeping into her chest and decided to be polite. As she approached, the man's sharp voice cut through the silence. "Hey, you! Stop right there." Sophia froze mid-step, startled by the harshness in his tone. She hadn't done anything wrong, so why was he calling out to her like that? "Hello," she stammered, offering a small nod as her heart began to race. The officer took a step closer, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel path. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his shadow stretching across the trail. His expression didn't soften as he looked her over, his eyes narrowing in a way that made her skin crawl. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, his voice cold and accusing. Sophia swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just here to see my dad. He's on duty today." "Your dad?" The officer sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "And who might that be?" "Captain Ethan Carter," she replied, hoping that mentioning her father's name would ease the tension. Instead, the officer's sneer deepened, and a low, mocking laugh escaped his lips. "Captain Carter's kid? Huh? Well, isn't that something?" he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. Sophia's cheeks burned with embarrassment and confusion. She didn't understand why he was acting this way, but his words carried a venom that made her want to retreat. "I just wanted to say hi to him," she added softly, taking a small step back. But the officer moved to block her path, his presence towering over her. "You think just because your daddy's in charge, you can walk around here like you own the place?" he snapped, leaning in close enough for her to catch the bitter scent of coffee on his breath. Sophia's throat tightened, and her confidence wavered. "No, I didn't mean that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man let out another sharp laugh, shaking his head as if she were a foolish child. "Kids like you," he said, his tone thick with disdain. "You think the rules don't apply to you, don't you?" Tears pricked at Sophia's eyes, but she blinked them back, determined not to let him see her cry. She took another step back, her body trembling with fear and confusion. "I should go," she murmured, her voice shaky. But before she could turn, his hand shot out and grabbed her arm. Sophia gasped, her heart pounding as his fingers dug into her skin. The grip was firm, unyielding, and she could feel the strength behind it. She tried to pull away, but he held her in place, his face darkening with a sinister smile. "Not so fast," he growled. "I'm not done with you yet." Sophia's mouth went dry and panic surged through her chest. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words were caught in her throat. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice trembling. The officer's eyes glinted with amusement, and he leaned in closer. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he sneered. "You think you're untouchable because of who your dad is?" Sophia shook her head frantically, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't understand why this was happening. The park was supposed to be safe. Her father had always assured her of that. But as the officer tightened his grip and his mocking gaze bore into hers, Sophia realized she was utterly alone. Sophia's entire body froze as the officer's grip tightened around her arm. His touch was rough, the pressure unrelenting, and she could feel her pulse racing beneath his fingers. Her mind screamed for her to break free, to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. I just wanted to see my dad," Sophia stammered, trying to keep her voice calm, though it trembled with fear. The man's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer. "You think you're special because your daddy wears a badge? Out here, kid. I make the rules. Not him." The venom in his voice sent chills down Sophia's spine. She felt utterly trapped, her usual sense of safety in the park now replaced by a growing terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer let out a harsh laugh, his fingers digging even deeper into her arm. "Wrong?" he echoed mockingly. "Walking around here like you own the place? Thinking you can do whatever you want just because your dad's Captain Carter? That's what you think is right?" Sophia shook her head, her tears threatening to spill over as she tried to explain. "No, I didn't think that at all. I just wanted to surprise him. Please let me go." But her pleas only seemed to amuse him further. He let go of her arm abruptly, and she stumbled back a step, her hand instinctively reaching up to rub the spot where his grip had been. The skin felt tender, and she knew there would be a bruise. Before she could even take another step, the officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a can of beer. He held it up in front of her, his smirk widening into something cruel. "Here," he said, thrusting the can toward her. "Go ahead, take a drink." Sophia recoiled, shaking her head vehemently. No, she said firmly, her voice still trembling but gaining a hint of resolve. I don't want to. The officer's smirk faded instantly, replaced by a cold, hard glare. Did I ask if you wanted to? He snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. He shoved the can closer to her, the metallic edge brushing against her fingers. Take it. Sophia tried to step back again, but his towering frame loomed over her, blocking her path. She shook her head once more, her voice trembling as she repeated, No, please. I don't want to. The man's expression darkened, his frustration boiling over. He grabbed her arm again, this time with more force, and shoved the can into her hand. The cold metal pressed against her palm, and she flinched at the contact. You don't get to tell me no, he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. I told you to drink. So drink. Sophia's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Her hands trembled as she clutched the can, trying to muster the courage to refuse again. I can't, she whispered, her voice breaking. The officer's grip tightened even further, his fingers digging into her skin as he raised the can to her lips. I wasn't asking, he sneered, tilting the can forward. Sophia twisted her head away, her tears finally spilling over as the sharp, bitter smell of the beer filled her nostrils. Some of the liquid spilled over, splashing onto her chin and soaking the front of her shirt. She choked on the taste, the bitterness burning her throat as she tried to pull away. The officer laughed a cruel and mocking sound that made her feel even smaller. What's the matter, princess? He taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. Not so tough now, are you? Sophia's mind raced, her body trembling as she tried to think of a way out. She wanted to scream for help, to call out for her dad, but the weight of fear pressed down on her chest, rendering her voice useless. The man finally pulled the can away, tossing it to the ground with a loud clang. Pathetic, he muttered, shaking his head as he looked her over with contempt. Sophia's vision blurred with tears as she stood frozen, unable to move. Her entire body felt like it was made of stone, and the humiliation and fear coursing through her veins made her feel powerless. Get lost, the officer sneered, waving her off dismissively. And tell your daddy he doesn't run this park, no matter what he thinks. His words hit her like a slap, but she didn't dare respond. She turned on shaky legs, her steps faltering as she tried to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man who had just shattered her sense of safety. But she didn't get far. The sound of heavy footsteps behind her made her blood run cold. She didn't have to look back to know it was him. Did I say you could leave? The officer barked, his voice sharp and filled with authority. Sophia stopped in her tracks, her breath hitching in her throat. Her entire body tensed as she felt his presence looming over her once again. I thought you told me to go, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man let out a short, mocking laugh. Oh, I did. But I'm not finished with you yet. Sophia turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she faced him. The cruel smirk on his face sent another wave of fear crashing over her. You think you can just walk away after that? He asked, stepping closer. You think you're better than me, don't you? Just another spoiled little brat who thinks the rules don't apply. I didn't mean, Sophia tried to protest, but he cut her off with a sharp glare. Enough, he snapped, his voice cold and unyielding. He reached out, grabbing her shoulder this time, and she winced at the pressure of his fingers digging into her skin. Sophia bit her lip, fighting back another wave of tears. She didn't know what to do. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, but she knew he'd catch her. He was too strong, too fast, and there was no one else around to help. As the man pulled her closer, Sophia caught a glimpse of movement in the distance. Her heart leaped with hope as she recognized the figure. Dad, she screamed, her voice breaking through the silence at last. The officer's grip faltered for a split second, just enough for Sophia to pull free. She stumbled back, her tears flowing freely as she saw her father running toward them, his face etched with worry and anger. Captain Ethan Carter sprinted toward the scene, his heart pounding harder with each step. From a distance, he had heard Sophia's panicked scream, a sound so raw and full of fear that it pierced him to his core. Now, as he closed the gap between them, his eyes locked onto his daughter's tear-streaked face and the towering figure of the officer looming over her. Bookmark back. Sophia stumbled backward as the officer turned toward her father. The man's confident smirk faltered when he saw Captain Carter, his posture shifting slightly as if bracing himself. But the arrogance didn't entirely leave his face. "Dad?" Sophia cried, her voice trembling. She ran to her father, who immediately wrapped her in his arms, holding her tightly. Ethan knelt down, his hands gently cupping her face as he inspected her for any signs of injury. His heart clenched at the sight of her red, tear-streaked cheeks and the bruise forming on her arm. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft yet urgent. Sophia shook her head, though fresh tears spilled down her face. He wouldn't let me go," she choked out, her voice breaking. "He made me. He tried to." Ethan's jaw tightened, his fury barely contained. He stood slowly, placing Sophia protectively behind him as he turned his attention to the officer. "What do you think you're doing?" Ethan demanded, his voice dangerously calm. The officer, whose badge read Henry Gates, crossed his arms and shrugged. "Just teaching her a little lesson, Captain," he said, his tone laced with false bravado. "Your daughter here thinks she's above the rules, wandering around like she owns the place." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, his entire body radiating restrained anger. "A lesson?" he repeated, his voice sharp. "By grabbing her? By forcing her to drink?" Henry's smirk returned, though it was weaker this time. "She needed to learn her place. You know how these kids are, thinking they can do whatever they want because of who their daddy is." Ethan took a deliberate step forward, his towering presence wiping the smug expression off Henry's face. "You laid your hands on my daughter. You abused your authority. And now you're trying to justify it?" Henry shifted uneasily, his confidence visibly cracking under Ethan's unrelenting glare. "Look, Captain, I didn't mean." But Ethan cut him off, his voice rising. "Enough." Pulling out his radio, Ethan's tone became brisk and authoritative. "This is Captain Carter. I need immediate backup at my location. Officer misconduct. Code red." Henry's face paled as the words sank in. He raised his hand slightly, attempting to feign innocence. "Captain, there's no need to escalate this. It's just a misunderstanding." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Misunderstanding? You grabbed my daughter, harassed her, and forced her into an act she didn't consent to. That's not a misunderstanding, it's a crime." The sound of approaching footsteps signaled the arrival of other officers, drawn by the urgency in Ethan's voice over the radio. Two uniformed officers hurried onto the scene, their faces tense as they assessed the situation. Ethan gestured toward Henry, his voice steady and firm. "Arrest him, now." Henry's bravado evaporated entirely as the officers moved to restrain him. "You can't be serious," he protested, his voice rising in desperation. "I didn't do anything that bad. She's just a kid." "Exactly," Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. "She's a child, and you as an officer of the law are supposed to protect her, not terrorize her." The officers cuffed Henry's wrists, their expressions grim as they led him away. He continued to protest, his voice growing fainter as the distance between them increased. Ethan turned back to Sophia, his demeanor softening instantly as he knelt before her again. "It's over," he murmured, his voice full of reassurance. "He can't hurt you anymore." Sophia's lip quivered as she leaned into her father's embrace, her small frame trembling against his strong arms. She clung to him tightly, feeling the safety and love she had been so desperate for just moments ago. The small crowd that had begun to gather watched silently, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and anger at what they had just witnessed. Ethan ignored their murmurs, focusing entirely on his daughter. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have been here sooner. I should have kept you safe." Sophia shook her head against his chest, her voice muffled. "It's not your fault, Dad. I didn't know this would happen." Ethan pulled back slightly to look her in the eyes, his gaze full of determination. "No one should ever treat you like that. Ever. And I promise you, Sophia, he will face the consequences for what he's done." Sophia nodded, her tears finally beginning to subside. She could feel the strength in her father's words, the certainty that justice would be served. As Ethan stood, he kept a protective arm around Sophia's shoulders, shielding her from the lingering stares of the crowd. His expression was resolute, his focus now shifting to ensuring his daughter's well-being. "We're going home," he said gently. "You've been through enough today." Sophia leaned into him as they walked away from the scene, and her steps unsteady, but guided by the unwavering support of her father. By the time Captain Ethan Carter and Sophia returned home, the weight of the day's events had fully settled on both of them. Sophia sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket her mother had given her as soon as they walked through the door. Her face was pale, her eyes still red from crying, but there was a quiet determination in her expression. Bookmark. Ethan sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder as he whispered gentle reassurances. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "I promise." Sophia's mother, Emily Carter, knelt in front of her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Do you want to talk about it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Sophia hesitated, then shook her head. "Not right now," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, understanding, and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Whenever you're ready, we're here." Meanwhile, Ethan's phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling his attention away. It was a message from his precinct, notifying him that Internal Affairs had been informed of the incident and would be launching a full investigation. Ethan clenched his jaw as he read the details. Henry Gates was already in custody, but there was still a long road ahead to ensure he was held accountable for his actions. The next morning, Ethan took Sophia to the precinct to give her statement. She was quiet during the car ride, her hands nervously fidgeting in her lap. Ethan glanced at her from the driver's seat, his heart aching at how vulnerable she looked. "You don't have to do this right away," he said, his voice gentle. "If you need more time." "No, I want to," Sophia interrupted, her voice firmer than before. She looked up at her father, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I don't want him to get away with what he did." Ethan nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "Okay. I'll be right there with you the whole time." When they arrived at the station, two investigators from Internal Affairs, Detective Ramirez and Detective Hunt, were waiting for them in a small conference room. The atmosphere was tense but professional, the detectives offering reassuring smiles as Ethan and Sophia entered. "Thank you for coming in, Sophia," Detective Ramirez said warmly as they all sat down. "We know this isn't easy, but your statement is very important. Take your time, and if you need a break, just let us know." Sophia nodded, gripping her father's hand tightly under the table. She took a deep breath, then began recounting everything that had happened in the park. She described her excitement to surprise her dad, the serene atmosphere of the park, and how everything changed when she encountered Henry Gates. Her voice wavered as she detailed his harsh words, the way he grabbed her arm, and the humiliation of being forced to drink from the beer can. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened as she spoke, his jaw clenching with every word. He had heard countless accounts of abuse and misconduct in his career, but hearing it from his own daughter was a pain unlike anything he had ever experienced. When Sophia finished, the room fell silent. Detective Ramirez exchanged a look with her partner, both of their faces reflecting the gravity of what they had just heard. "Thank you, Sophia," Ramirez said finally, her tone filled with respect. "You were very brave in sharing this with us. We'll make sure he's held accountable for his actions." Sophia nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "I just don't want him to do this to anyone else," she said softly. Ethan felt a surge of pride as he looked at his daughter. Despite everything she had endured, she was still thinking about protecting others. As news of the incident spread, the community's reaction was swift and fierce. Word of Henry Gates's misconduct had leaked to the local media, and soon the story was making headlines. Residents expressed outrage at the idea of an officer abusing his authority, especially against a child. Ethan and Sophia were inundated with messages of support from friends, neighbors, and even strangers. Flowers and handwritten notes began arriving at their door, many of them from people sharing their own stories of facing mistreatment or abuse of power. Sophia was overwhelmed by the outpouring of empathy. One evening, as she sifted through the pile of messages, she found a letter from a mother whose teenage daughter had faced bullying at school. "Your bravery has given my daughter the courage to speak up," the letter read. "Thank you for being a voice for those who feel like they don't have one." Sophia clutched the letter tightly, tears welling in her eyes. She hadn't realized how far-reaching her story could be, or how much of an impact her voice could have. In the days that followed, Ethan threw himself into ensuring that real change came from the incident. He attended meeting after meeting with local officials and police leadership, pushing for stricter guidelines on officer conduct and more comprehensive sensitivity training. At one such meeting, a council member approached him, speaking earnestly. "Captain Carter, your daughter's experience has shed light on a serious issue within our department. We want to make sure this never happens again." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "It's not just about my daughter," he said. "This is about every person who comes into contact with law enforcement. We're supposed to protect them, not abuse their trust." The council member agreed, outlining plans to establish a new community advisory board. The board would consist of citizens, activists, and representatives from the police force, working together to address concerns and ensure accountability. When Ethan told Sophia about the advisory board later that evening, her eyes widened with surprise. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" she asked. "I do," Ethan replied firmly, "and they've asked if you'd like to be a part of it." Sophia's jaw dropped. "Me? But I'm just a kid." "You're more than that," Ethan said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've shown courage most adults couldn't. People trust you, Sophia. They believe in you, and so do I." After a moment of contemplation, Sophia nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." Ethan smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "You're going to make a difference, sweetheart." Sophia's involvement in the advisory board marked the beginning of a larger movement. She attended meetings, shared her story at town halls, and spoke at events focused on promoting justice and reform. Her voice became a symbol of resilience and hope, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. At one community event, a woman approached Sophia with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Because of you, I feel safer letting my children walk through the park again." Sophia felt a lump form in her throat as she listened, realizing just how much her actions had impacted the lives of others. Through it all, her family remained her anchor. Her mother's warm embrace and her father's steady presence reminded her that she wasn't alone in this journey. Together, they navigated the challenges that came with being at the center of a movement for change. For Ethan, seeing his daughter's strength fueled his own determination to create a safer, more just community. The incident had shaken him to his core, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. Sophia's decision to join the Community Advisory Board was a turning point, not just for her but for the entire town. At first, she felt overwhelmed, sitting in a room full of seasoned activists, council members, and police representatives. The discussions were intense, often filled with technical jargon she didn't fully understand. But every time she felt out of place, she remembered her father's words. "People trust you, Sophia." Her first meeting was a whirlwind. The board discussed proposed changes to officer conduct guidelines, new procedures for handling complaints, and plans to introduce regular sensitivity training. When it was her turn to speak, Sophia hesitated. All eyes were on her, and for a moment, the weight of the room felt crushing. Then she thought about that day in the park. The fear, the humiliation, the way Henry Gates had looked at her like she was nothing. The memory ignited a spark of determination. "I don't know all the rules or policies you're talking about," she began, her voice steady but soft. "But I know what it feels like to be powerless, to think that no one will believe you. That's why this is important, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been scared to speak up." Her words hung in the air for a moment before the room erupted into applause. The board members were visibly moved, nodding in agreement. The council chairperson leaned forward, her expression serious yet encouraging. "Thank you, Sophia. Your voice is exactly what this board needs." Word of Sophia's involvement spread quickly. Local news outlets picked up her story, framing her as a symbol of resilience and hope. Her name became synonymous with the fight for justice, and people began reaching out to her family, sharing their own experiences with misconduct or abuse. One evening, as Sophia scrolled through her email, she came across a message from a high school student named Mia. "Hi, Sophia," it read. "I'm not sure if you'll see this, but I wanted to thank you. My little brother was bullied by a security guard at school last year, but we didn't say anything because we were scared no one would care. After hearing your story, I feel like we can finally speak up." Sophia's chest tightened as she read the words. She replied immediately, offering Mia words of encouragement and assuring her that her voice mattered. The interaction stuck with Sophia. She realized that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was part of something bigger. As invitations to speak at events poured in, Sophia initially hesitated. The thought of standing in front of a crowd made her stomach churn. But each time her father gently reminded her that she didn't have to go, she found herself saying, yes. Her first public speech was at her school's assembly. The gymnasium was packed with students, teachers, and parents. Sophia's hands trembled as she stepped up to the podium, gripping the edges tightly to steady herself. She began by sharing the story of that afternoon in the park, describing how excited she had been to see her dad and how quickly everything had changed. Her voice faltered as she recounted Henry Gates's actions, but she pressed on, refusing to let the memory silence her. I thought no one would care, she admitted, her voice gaining strength. But then all of you, my family, my friends, my community, you showed me I wasn't alone. And that's why I'm standing here today. Because no one should ever feel powerless, and no one should ever feel like their voice doesn't matter. The gym erupted in applause, students rising to their feet as tears welled in Sophia's eyes. For the first time since that day in the park, she felt a sense of peace. Afterward, several classmates approached her, some sharing their own experiences and others simply thanking her for her courage. One boy, who had always been quiet in class, told her how her story had inspired him to stand up to a bully. Sophia smiled, realizing that her words were making a difference. With each event she attended, Sophia grew more confident. At town halls and community forums, she spoke about the need for accountability and the importance of creating a culture of respect and kindness. At one forum, a mother stood up during the Q&A session, her voice trembling as she spoke. Sophia, I just want to say thank you. My daughters are 6 and 8, and because of you, I feel like they'll grow up in a safer world. Sophia's heart swelled as she listened. She had once felt powerless, but now she was helping others find their own strength. Her advocacy also brought tangible changes. The police department began implementing new training programs, focusing on de-escalation tactics and cultural sensitivity. A hotline was established for reporting misconduct anonymously, ensuring that people felt safe coming forward. The advisory board's efforts didn't go unnoticed. State officials reached out, expressing interest in replicating their model in other communities. For Ethan Carter, watching his daughter lead these discussions filled him with immense pride. You've turned something horrible into something meaningful, he told her one evening as they prepared for another board meeting. That takes strength, Sophia. Real strength. Sophia smiled at her father, the warmth of his words settling over her like a protective shield. Sophia's journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, when the memory of Henry Gates's cruel laughter or the taste of the beer he had forced on her came rushing back like a tidal wave. But each time she felt herself sinking, her family was there to pull her back up. Her mother's soothing words and her father's steadfast support reminded her that she wasn't alone. One day, as she was walking home from a board meeting, a woman stopped her on the sidewalk. "Are you Sophia Carter?" the woman asked, her tone filled with both awe and gratitude. "Yes," Sophia replied, surprised. The woman smiled, her eyes glistening. "I just wanted to thank you. What you're doing, it matters. You're giving people hope." Sophia's heart swelled at the woman's words. She nodded, her voice soft but sincere. "Thank you. That means a lot." As she continued her walk, she thought about how far she had come. The fear and pain of that day in the park still lingered, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they had become fuel for her mission to create a safer, more just community. By the end of the year, Sophia had become a household name in her town. Her story was featured in local newspapers and even caught the attention of a national news outlet. But for Sophia, the most meaningful moments were the quiet ones. When a parent thanked her for inspiring their child, or when a student told her they felt brave enough to stand up for themselves because of her. Sophia's family couldn't have been prouder. Her mother often reminded her to take breaks and care for herself, while her father made sure to be by her side for every major event. "You've started something bigger than any of us could have imagined," Ethan told her during a quiet moment at home. "And I know you'll see it through." Sophia nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. She had once felt powerless, but now she knew the truth. Her voice could change the world. Sophia Carter's story had become a catalyst for change far beyond what anyone could have imagined. What had begun as a deeply personal ordeal in the park now ignited discussions in classrooms, council meetings, and even state legislatures. People across the town and soon the country began to see her as a voice for the voiceless. The new Community Advisory Board, which Sophia had initially felt nervous about joining, became the epicenter of reform in the town's police department. Its meetings often drew significant public attention, with concerned citizens packing the halls to offer their input. Sophia sat among seasoned activists and local leaders, her presence reminding everyone why they were there. Over time, the board's work began to bear fruit. Among the most significant changes was the introduction of mandatory sensitivity training for all police officers. These sessions focused on de-escalation tactics, the appropriate use of authority, and understanding the impact of racial and social biases. Accountability isn't just about punishing bad behavior. Sophia explained during one meeting, it's about creating a system that prevents it from happening in the first place. Her words resonated deeply, and soon neighboring towns were contacting the board for guidance on implementing similar reforms. The police department also established an independent oversight committee tasked with investigating complaints of officer misconduct. Sophia's father, Captain Ethan Carter, played a pivotal role in these efforts. While he had always taken pride in his work, the events involving his daughter had given him a sharper sense of purpose. He threw his energy into making the department a model of transparency and trustworthiness. At one press conference, Ethan stood alongside the police chief, addressing the media about the reforms underway. "We owe it to our community to do better," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "No one is above the law, and no one should fear the very people sworn to protect them." Sophia watched from the sidelines, pride swelling in her chest. Her father had always been her hero, but now he was a hero to so many others as well. As news of Sophia's advocacy spread, her story began to reach beyond her town. A national news outlet picked up her story, featuring her in an in-depth article titled "The Teen Who Took on the System and Won." Journalists praised her courage, and community leaders from across the country reached out to learn more about the changes she had inspired. Sophia was invited to speak at conferences and events where her words carried the same authenticity and passion that had first captivated her hometown. One such event was a youth leadership summit in the state capitol. Standing on a stage before hundreds of young people, Sophia recounted her journey. "Change doesn't happen all at once," she told the audience, her voice strong and clear. "It starts with one voice. Sometimes that voice feels small and scary, but when others join in, it becomes something powerful. That's what happened to me, and that's what can happen to you." The crowd erupted into applause, and afterward, dozens of students approached her to thank her for sharing her story. One girl, barely holding back tears, told Sophia, "You made me realize it's okay to speak up, even when it's hard." With the growing momentum of the movement came challenges. Not everyone supported the reforms, and some were openly critical of Sophia's role in them. Online comments occasionally questioned her motives or dismissed her as a kid who didn't understand the bigger picture. At first, the negativity hurt. Sophia found herself questioning whether she was truly making a difference or if the critics were right. But her parents were quick to remind her of the impact she had already made. "Look at the people who've thanked you," Emily Carter told her during one particularly tough evening. "Look at the changes happening because of you. Don't let a few loud voices drown out all the good you've done." Ethan echoed the sentiment, his tone firm but loving. "Sophia, criticism will always come when you challenge the status quo, but you're stronger than that. You've already proven it." Sophia nodded, their words giving her the strength to push forward. Despite the criticism, Sophia focused on fostering dialogue between the police and the community. She believed that real change required trust and understanding on both sides. At one town hall, tensions ran high as citizens voiced their frustrations with law enforcement. Sophia, seated at the front of the room, listened intently to each story. When it was her turn to speak, she addressed the crowd with the same sincerity that had become her hallmark. I know what it's like to feel betrayed by the people who are supposed to protect you, she began, her voice steady despite the charged atmosphere. But I also know that there are good officers out there, like my dad, who want to make things right. We can hold them accountable while also supporting the ones who are working to rebuild trust. This isn't about taking sides, it's about coming together. Her words seemed to strike a chord. By the end of the meeting, many attendees approached her, expressing their appreciation for her ability to bring people together. The reforms in Sophia's town sparked a ripple effect across the state. Other communities began adopting similar policies, and the advisory board's model was heralded as a blueprint for effective citizen oversight. Sophia continued to balance her advocacy work with school and her personal life. While the demands were often exhausting, she found joy in the small victories, like receiving a letter from a mother who thanked her for inspiring her son to pursue a career in community activism. One day, while walking through Brookfield Park with her father, Sophia noticed a group of children playing near the creek. Their laughter echoed through the trees, and she felt a pang of bittersweet emotion. This place feels different now, she admitted quietly. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's not the same as it was, he said. But maybe that's a good thing. It's safer now. Better. Sophia smiled, realizing he was right. The park, once a place of fear and pain, had become a symbol of change and hope. Months later, the town held a community event to celebrate the progress made since the creation of the advisory board. Ethan was invited to speak, and Sophia was asked to join him on stage. As Ethan addressed the crowd, he spoke about the lessons he had learned, not just as a captain, but as a father. My daughter taught me something that no amount of training or experience ever could, he said, his voice filled with emotion. She showed me the power of courage, the power of one voice, and she reminded me why we do what we do, not for the badges, but for the people we're sworn to protect. The crowd erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Ethan turned to Sophia, pulling her into a hug as the applause continued. None of this would have happened without you, he whispered. Sophia smiled, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time, she truly felt the weight of everything they had accomplished together. Months turned into a year, and Sophia Carter's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The scars of that day in the park remained, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they had become a testament to her resilience and the power of standing up for justice. The reforms initiated by the Community Advisory Board had taken root, reshaping how the local police department operated. New guidelines for officer conduct were strictly enforced, and mandatory sensitivity training became a regular part of the department's routine. Complaints of misconduct were now handled swiftly and transparently, with the Independent Oversight Committee holding officers accountable. The ripple effect of these changes extended far beyond their town. Across the state, communities began adopting similar measures, inspired by Sophia's story and the collective action it had sparked. Bookmark. Life at home for Sophia and her family also found a new sense of balance. Though the attention from the media and community was at times overwhelming, the Carters remained grounded in their love and support for one another. Emily Carter had become Sophia's quiet pillar of strength, always ready with a comforting hug or few words of encouragement. You've done so much, Sophia, she often reminded her. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. Ethan Carter continued his dual role as both a dedicated police captain and Sophia's unwavering champion. His work within the department was driven by a renewed sense of purpose, and his pride in Sophia's achievements was evident in every conversation. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Ethan spoke with a smile. You know, they're calling us the Carter model at the precinct. Sophia raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? They've started using our town as an example, Ethan explained. Other departments are asking about our advisory board, the oversight committee, and the reforms we've implemented. You've set a standard, kiddo. Sophia blushed at the compliment, though she couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. A few weeks later, Sophia was invited to a special event at her school, though the details were kept under wraps. When she arrived with her parents, she was surprised to find the gymnasium filled with students, teachers, and members of the community. At the front of the room, the principal stood behind a podium, beaming with pride. "Today, we're here to honor one of our own," she began, her voice carrying through the space. "Someone who has shown us all the meaning of courage and resilience. Someone who has turned their pain into progress, not just for themselves, but for all of us." Sophia's heart raced as she realized they were talking about her. The principal gestured for Sophia to join her on stage. As she walked up, the room erupted into applause, the sound filling her ears and bringing tears to her eyes. "Sophia Carter," the principal continued, "it is my privilege to present you with the Brookfield Community Leadership Award. Your bravery has inspired change, and your efforts have made our town and our world a better place." Sophia accepted the award, her hands trembling slightly as she held the plaque. She turned to the audience, a lump forming in her throat as she prepared to speak. "I never expected any of this," she began, her voice soft but steady. "All I wanted was to feel safe again. But what I've learned is that safety isn't just something we're given. It's something we create. Together." The crowd erupted into another standing ovation, her parents clapping proudly from the front row. The recognition Sophia received was a humbling reminder of how far she had come. But for her, the work was far from over. She continued to attend advisory board meetings and speak at events, determined to use her platform to amplify the voices of others. One day, as she prepared for a town hall, her father joined her in the living room, holding a notebook filled with his own notes. "You're becoming quite the pro at this," he said with a grin, sitting beside her. Sophia laughed. "I had a pretty good role model." Ethan chuckled, nudging her playfully. "You're the one leading the charge now. I'm just following your example." Sophia smiled, the bond between them stronger than ever. Not long after the town hall, Sophia received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain with no return address, but the handwriting was neat and deliberate. Inside was a simple, handwritten note. "Sophia, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted to say that I'm sorry about everything. Your courage showed me what it means to truly take responsibility for my actions. Thank you for helping me see that, even if I didn't deserve your kindness." Sophia stared at the letter for a long time, her emotions swirling. She wasn't sure how to feel, anger, sadness, or even pity. But what she did know was that she didn't need his apology to move forward. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer, deciding to leave it there as a reminder of how far she had come. As the months passed, Sophia found herself mentoring younger students who looked up to her. She visited schools, talking to kids about standing up for themselves and others. She shared her story not to gain sympathy, but to show them that their voices mattered. One day, after speaking to a group of middle school students, the young girl approached her. "My name's Lily," the girl said shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you. My brother's a police officer, and he says you're the reason he's working harder to be a better person. He says he wants to make you proud." Sophia knelt to the girl's level, her heart swelling. "Tell your brother I'm proud of him," she said with a smile. The Carters' impact continued to grow, but they never lost sight of what mattered most: each other. Their experiences had brought them closer, forging a bond that nothing could break. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Ethan turned to Sophia with a thoughtful expression. "You know, someday, you're going to change the world," he said. Sophia laughed, shaking her head. "I think I've had enough world-changing for now." Ethan chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You might not see it, but you already have." As Sophia prepared to begin high school, she felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew she was ready for whatever came next. Her story had taught her that even in the face of fear and injustice, there was always a way to make things right. And with her family and community by her side, she felt unstoppable. Looking out the window of her room one evening, Sophia thought about how much had changed since that day in the park. The pain of that moment would always be with her, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become a part of a larger journey, one that she was still writing. With a deep breath, she smiled to herself, feeling the warmth of hope in her chest. The future was bright, and she was ready to face it head-on. Sophia's story is one that lingers long after the final moments unfold. It's a journey of fear transformed into courage, of injustice met with unwavering resolve, and of a single voice igniting change. Her experiences remind us of the power of resilience, the importance of accountability, and the strength that comes from standing together as a community. At its heart, this story sheds light on a universal truth. Safety, fairness, and respect are rights that belong to everyone. Sophia's bravery in the face of adversity serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how small we may feel in a moment of despair, our actions can leave a lasting impact. Whether it's speaking out against injustice, supporting someone in need, or fostering change within our own circles, we all have the ability to make a difference. Captain Ethan Carter's steadfast support and determination to bring about change also highlight the vital role of allies and advocates. True leadership isn't about holding power, it's about using it to protect and uplift others. His bond with Sophia and their shared mission remind us that even in the darkest times, love and perseverance can shine through, lighting the way forward. Sophia's story isn't just a tale of survival, it's an inspiration. It challenges us to reflect on the systems and relationships around us and to strive for a world where no one feels powerless or voiceless. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reactions and experiences in the comments below. If you found the story inspiring, leave a comment with 1. If it truly resonated and you think it's exceptional, type 2. We'd also love to hear your own stories of courage, resilience, or the moments that have shaped your life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring stories like this one. Let us know what this story means to you in the comments. We can't wait to read what you have to share.